In 2015, 17-year-olds in El Salvador weren't dreaming about prom or college. They were choosing which gang tattoo to get and where to hide a gun. That year alone, 6,656 people were murdered. And yet less than a decade later, El Salvador became the safest country in Latin America. This is what happens when a country stops asking for peace and decides to take it. For years, El Salvador wasn't run by its government. It was run by shadows. MS-13 and Barrio 18 weren't just street gangs, they were parallel governments. They set curfews, enforced laws, taxed businesses, and dictated who lived and who died. In some areas, calling the police wasn't an option because the police wouldn't come, or worse, they were already bought off. The roots of this crisis trace back to the civil war that ravaged El Salvador from 1980 to 1992. The conflict displaced thousands, fractured families, and exported trauma to Los Angeles. There, Salvadoran immigrants formed MS-13 as a means of protection in gang-ridden neighborhoods. But when the US deported these members en masse in the 1990s, El Salvador became the unwilling host to a virus it couldn't contain. Over time, MS-13 and Barrio 18 transformed from street crews into militarized multinational operations. Extortion, human trafficking, assassinations. These weren't side hustles. They were business models. And the victims were everywhere. Children recruited as young as 12, families forced to flee north, entire towns emptied by fear. 1 in every 12 Salvadorans had some direct link to gang activity. That's not a subculture, that's a society. In neighborhoods ruled by gangs, life became a constant performance of survival. Residents memorized invisible borders, obeyed unwritten rules, and lived under the gaze of armed teens who enforced their version of order with brutality. The police? Often invisible or complicit. Schools became recruiting grounds. Hospitals were off limits without gang approval. Even the simple act of opening a corner store came with a price: extortion fees or death. Entire generations grew up knowing fear as routine. In this climate, the state seemed powerless, or worse, absent. The gangs didn't fill a void. They became the void. And for decades, there was no end in sight. Then came the pivot. March 2022. A weekend massacre leaves 87 civilians dead. President Nayib Bukele, just 3 years into his term, calls it the final straw. Within 48 hours, he declares a national state of emergency, a move that hadn't been used for crime in the country's modern history. The crackdown is immediate, swift, unforgiving. By the end of the first week, 6,000 people were arrested, then 10,000, then 20,000. Within 2 months, over 33,000 suspected gang members are behind bars. And by 2024, the number reaches 80,000, more than the standing armies of Norway and Sweden combined. Entire neighborhoods were sealed off. Military checkpoints sprang up overnight. Surveillance drones buzzed overhead. Armored vehicles rolled through residential blocks as if war had been declared. Not on another country, but on El Salvador's citizens. Soldiers burst into homes at dawn, pulling suspects out barefoot, shirtless, stunned. These arrests didn't require warrants. Not even proof. Social media photos, anonymous tips, visible tattoos, all were enough to land someone in a prison van. Civil liberties were suspended. Habeas corpus, gone. Trials, delayed. Defense lawyers, blocked. Bukele's government even redefined what a gang member was. If you helped, supported, or were just associated with someone in a gang, you could be charged. Children as young as 12 were now legally considered prosecutable gang affiliates. The message was clear: you're either with the state or you're in its way. The pace was relentless. Entire communities found themselves under a new regime, one not ruled by gangs but by the military. Streets once dominated by tattoos and whispered threats were now patrolled by soldiers in black masks and riot gear. There were no warnings, no second chances. Overnight, the fear shifted from criminal gangs to government forces. To hold the flood of prisoners, the government built the Terrorism Confinement Center, a brutal supermax the size of 50 football fields, holding up to 40,000 men. No visitors, no sunlight, no rehabilitation. Inside, conditions were medieval. Cells built for 80 held men shoulder to shoulder. Lights stayed on 24/7. Inmates were denied beds, books, and even time outdoors. A 30-minute group stretch in a concrete hallway was the closest thing to freedom. And no one gets out. On paper, the numbers are staggering. In 2015, El Salvador had the highest homicide rate in the world. By 2024, it dropped to 1.9 per 100,000 people. That's safer than the United States, Mexico, Brazil. safer than many European nations. The decline is more than statistical, it's existential. One police officer in downtown San Salvador reported that known gang hangouts were cleared in just 2 weeks. No shootouts, no negotiations, just disappearances of criminals in fear. Extortion? Gone. A bus company that once paid $6,000 a month to 3 gangs now pays nothing. Families walk freely through neighborhoods that once resembled war zones. Community centers have reopened. Soccer fields, once claimed by gangs, are filled with children again. This wave of peace swept across sectors. Education. Schools in high-risk zones report attendance up by 40%. Dropout rates have plummeted, and parents now feel safe walking their children to school for the first time in years. Tourism. Bookings in once taboo regions like La Libertad are at an all-time high. Cruise ships have returned. Surf tourism is booming. Business investment. A 2023 IMF report noted that foreign direct investment had increased by 30%, crediting security and stability as the key factors. Entrepreneurs once paralyzed by fear are opening shops, cafes, and startups in once abandoned districts. Bukele's popularity skyrocketed. Re-elected in 2024 with 83% of the vote, he holds one of the highest approval ratings in the world. State media call him the man who saved El Salvador. Social media calls him a legend, but the silence has its own cost. The government admits that 7,000 detainees have been quietly released for lack of evidence. But human rights groups say that's just the tip of the iceberg. According to humanitarian legal aid networks, at least 20,000 people behind bars may be innocent, many with no criminal records or gang ties, arrested for living in the wrong neighborhood or having the wrong haircut. Families whisper stories of missing sons. Mothers beg reporters for updates. Civil society, once a loud chorus of watchdogs, is increasingly muted. Journalists operate under growing scrutiny. Courts are heavily politicized. The president's party, Nuevas Ideas, controls the legislature, and critics argue that power is now dangerously centralized. And that massive prison? It doesn't just hold criminals, it holds questions no one is allowed to ask. The rest of Latin America is watching. In 2022, Honduras declared its state of emergency, trying to emulate Bukele's iron-fisted model. But by 2023, the results were already faltering. Violence remained unchanged. Gangs under pressure simply moved operations to rural zones. Extortion cases even increased. Critics argued the crackdown was more publicity stunt than a policy. Why? Because unlike El Salvador, Honduras lacked the institutional control over police, courts, and media to execute a sustained campaign. It turns out you can't just declare war on crime. You have to control the battlefield. Other nations, Guatemala, Ecuador, even parts of Mexico, have flirted with similar approaches. Some whisper about a Bukele doctrine sweeping the hemisphere, prioritize order, marginalize dissent, sacrifice liberties for peace. For some leaders, it's a tempting shortcut in countries exhausted by chaos. But imitation without infrastructure is dangerous. When states copy Bukele's strategy without his grip on military, legislative, and media apparatuses, they risk creating a vacuum worse than the one they're trying to fill. The result? Temporary fear for permanent instability. Honduras proved that uniforms and checkpoints alone don't win back control. Without trust, coordination, and legitimacy, crackdowns may only shift violence, not end it. And in the absence of real reform, today's strongman becomes tomorrow's crisis. El Salvador's success brings with it a dangerous template. For leaders seeking fast results, civil liberties can be painted as luxuries. Emergency powers once enacted rarely get rolled back. And when public safety becomes the only currency, democracy can quietly be traded away. That's the haunting truth beneath this transformation. Yes, the gangs are gone, but so are many legal norms. Due process, transparency, oversight, the very principles that separate justice from revenge. So what now? Right now, most Salvadorans are celebrating, rightfully so. They're safer. They're freer to move, to live, to dream. But at what cost and for how long? Because prisons don't stay closed forever. Regimes don't remain popular forever. And when the emergency powers finally fade, the country will have to answer for every innocent life caught in the crossfire. What happens when a boy arrested at 14 turns 30, still behind bars without trial? When families spend decades waiting for justice that never comes, not from gangs, but from the government sworn to protect them? Did El Salvador solve its gang problem, or simply bury it behind 20-foot walls? What's been built might be safe, but it could also be a trap. One forged from silence, sealed by fear, and justified by numbers. When fear is your compass, you may walk in circles, safe but lost. And when the state becomes the sole arbiter of guilt, no one is truly free. This is what happens when a tiny nation deletes its gangs and discovers the silence isn't as empty as it seems. Because silence can cradle peace or conceal injustice. It can be the sound of healing or the hush before history repeats. El Salvador may have conquered violence, but in doing so, it risks forgetting freedom.